BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and thanks for listening to the Farming Today podcast. I'm Kaz Graham, and in this episode, why there's more to meat than chops and steak. We're at a farm shop in Lincolnshire that's educating its customers to use the less glamorous and less expensive cuts of a carcass. And Cleopatra would be happy. There's good news on dairy exports to Egypt.
250 million is the sort of midpoint of our estimate of the value of this over the course of the next 5 years or so. So, it's really quite substantial.
More on those opportunities for dairy farmers a little later. But we start with cattle from a bygone era that would bear very little resemblance to the sleek milk-producing cows on today's farms. The auroch is regarded as the wild ancestor of the cattle we see on farms today. Archaeological remains show that they were huge beasts and that they roamed across Europe through the Bronze Age. Recent excavations in the Yorkshire Dales have unearthed what might be the last recorded auroch in the UK. Herds of them used to wander across the Dales, according to Tom Lord, who farms between Settle and Malham. He's been telling me about these ancient cattle that once lived in the hills where he now keeps sheep.
An auroch is a very big, wild cow. The bulls are nearly 5'6" to the shoulder, 1.50 to 2 meters at the shoulder. They were here at the end of the Ice Age and then right through, and then they go extinct.
And they actually found remains of an auroch in the caves in the Yorkshire Dales. Loads of cave complexes around there. Have you found remains yourself?
They're found in deep cave shafts where they seem to have fallen in. I live here. So the potholers might come to me and say, oh, we've got this bone, what is it? And I'll tell them what it is and then get it through to a specialist.
Have you seen bones that you reckon must have come from aurochs?
Oh, yeah. I mean, aurochs are very recognisable. They're big cattle bones and we get what have been entire animals. We would have had the entire skeleton down some of these cave shafts. So we get lots of bones.
So how far back do they go?
They're here from the end of the Ice Age until about 4,000 years ago. And just recently, very excitingly, we've got a date which is one of the youngest dates for aurochs anywhere in Britain, about 3,800 years ago. So that's what the archaeologists call the early Bronze Age, where there's big changes going on in the countryside because the farming systems start to change.
And is there much evidence of what we might call farmed cattle and of those farming systems?
Well, what's so interesting here, amongst the bones from the caves, we find domestic cattle bones. And domestic cattle come with the first farmers into Britain about 6,000 years ago. So we've got a period of something like 2,000 years where wild cattle, the aurochs, are here with domestic cattle.
Would they have interbred? Would the farmers have actually wanted to try and develop cattle that were somewhat bigger than the ones that they'd brought with them when they came and settled?
The cattle they bring with them originally were descended from aurochs, but they were domesticated in the Middle East. And as the early farmers bring their domestic cattle from the Middle East, there's evidence that there is interbreeding. And then once they get to Britain, we're in the early stages of trying to work that puzzle out. But of course, what we have in Britain, we have got primitive domestic cattle, breeds like Highland and the Irish Curry. And when we look at the DNA of those breeds, they do have aurochs, wild cattle genes in them.
And cattle now are being bred to resemble aurochs for use in wilding or rewilding projects. What light could these remains shine on that kind of work?
I think at the moment there is a danger these projects are going forward with actually only a limited understanding of what was here previously. There's still an awful lot we don't know. We don't know about early farming systems, how they worked. They must have been good at it to keep going in these uplands. But there's so much we don't know. Bit by bit, it's like putting a jigsaw together. We are finding pieces, but we've an awful lot still to find out. I think it is important that in the national park, this is the Yorkshire Dales National Park, there is a better understanding of the history of livestock farming and how it has shaped the landscape. And in places, especially with our wildflowers and so on, species-rich habitat. It was the domestic livestock and their management which created them. So domestic livestock are not something separate from wild creatures. It's all part of the natural history of the Yorkshire Dales.
Oh, fascinating stuff. That's Tom Lord in the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Now, I'm not quite sure what the meat of an auroch would have tasted like. Maybe beefy, gamey. But it's highly likely that Bronze Age farmers and hunters would have eaten every little scrap of it, something that we're not so good at nowadays. For small-scale and niche meat producers, working out what to do with the unpopular cuts, things like offal, can be a challenge. Finding a market for every part of a meat animal, not just the popular cuts like bacon and steak, is known as carcass balance, and it's something we're talking about all this week. Mary Ward-Lowry has been to visit a farm in Lincolnshire to find out how they manage it.
I've just driven up the sandy lane towards Redhill Farm near Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. Sometimes when you come up here, you have to wait for a couple of piglets to cross the road because this is a properly free-range pig farm and the piglets can go wherever they like. Jane and Terry Tomlinson were pioneers of this way of raising outdoor pigs. Carcass balance is something that they've always had to consider. As the pigs are tucking into some food, I'm meeting Jane to find out more.
The subject of full carcass butchery, it was the very first consideration when it started 27 years ago, and it still is today. People default to the prime cut all the time because they think, oh, we have to have that because that's the best cut, that'll taste the nicest. You probably default to chops because you feel uncomfortable if you don't know the name of a certain cut. With a bit of knowledge and a bit of skill and maybe a little bit more time, you can use any cut.
They mostly sell their pork direct to customers. We've come to the shop to see what kinds of products they make and sell.
We've got our free-range pork, we've got our grass-fed beef and lamb, and then we've got our sausages, our hazelets, Lincolnshire hazelet, which is Lincolnshire sausage meat. You sort of slap it and turn it, and that gets the air out in the middle, and then you roast it in the oven. You get all that lovely caramelised outside, and then you just have it like a cold cut and just slice it thinly. It knocks the socks off most charcuterie.
Looks like a little hedgehog, doesn't it?
It does.
So Jane and Terry learnt traditional methods of butchery in order to make the best use of the whole pig. Oh, I can see lots of trotters here. Yes. I was wondering what you do with the trotters.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, apart from a few customers,
specialists,
that value them, we don't. And this is part of it. If you look at our waste bin, this wouldn't happen in a food processor. All that would be sausages. But for us, this is...
So is that half a head?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Some skin.
Yeah, but lots of meat still on.
Yeah.
This doesn't go to waste. All this goes to kennels, and the hounds eat the lot.
You might not want to see all those trotters and pigs' heads in the waste bin, but if you do, you can look through the window to watch the butchers at work. And Jane says that helping people understand the philosophy behind the way they farm is key.
If we get, say, an inquiry from a new restaurant, and it might be a really nice restaurant that we would love to supply, then when they turn around they say, well, can we have 50 loins a week? And we say, well, sorry, no, because we only do 12 pigs a week. And it's always that middle, which is your chops, because in this country, it's the only country where we eat chops, but we also like bacon. And you can't have both all the time. So that's
it's
why
the same cut of meat.
Yes, loin is in demand all the time, and obviously it's the prime cut. But what we've been able to do is show people how delicious the shoulder is. We use the offal. We have our liver, which sells anyway because a lot of people can't get really good quality liver. We make our own pate. We also actually do a raw dog food with the hearts and bits of sinew and
bones.
No, we don't grind bones at all.
Some...
But we give bones away, dog bones. If you're a customer, you can have them with pleasure. And then a lot of people are getting on to bone broth.
I mean, you've had to do a lot of education of yourself, I suppose, but also of other people.
Yeah, and also the cookery demos at the Lincolnshire show and the cultural shows to help people realise how easy it is actually to cook a lot of these things. But I never used a prime cut ever in any of those cookery demos, and stick to what we do and try and do it really well.
That's Jane Tomlinson ending that report from Mary Ward-Lowry. The UK exported £26 million worth of dairy produce to Egypt last year. We're one of the North African country's leading dairy suppliers. But new regulations the Egyptian government was planning to introduce at the start of 2026 would have created an expensive trade barrier. New rules on the Halal certification of dairy produce would have added significant costs to exporters. Halal certification, that's guaranteeing that a product is compliant with Islamic law, is usually associated with meat, but some preservatives and additives, like say enzymes or rennet in cheese, may be non-halal. Well, the government has now reached a deal with Egypt, meaning that the new regulations won't be applied. And that could be worth, they say, £250 million over 5 years for dairy farmers. John Humphrey is His Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Africa, and he spoke to me from South Africa just before heading to Egypt.
Back in 2021, the Egyptian government essentially announced that they were going to expand the halal certification regime, and that was going to bring in dairy products that previously hadn't been included. And that would have put a sort of, significant additional cost on every shipment potentially going into Egypt.
And how damaging would the introduction of that halal certification have been for the trade in dairy products with Egypt?
Potentially, it could have really reduced them. And then there's always the question around where those costs get picked up. Do they get picked up by the consumers? Do they get picked up by suppliers or by importers? And of course, market sort of dynamics drive that. But we've sort of looked at it, and the 250 million is the sort of midpoint of our estimate of the value of this over the course of the next 5 years or so. So, it's really quite substantial. I mean, I was in business for many, many years, and I always think it's the market access, the regulations. Those are the things that always catch you out.
And so have other countries been able to negotiate changes as well?
Yeah, it is. It's a broad change. It doesn't just affect the UK. So the Egyptians said they were going to broaden their halal certification regime coming in at the end of this year. And that would have affected all dairy imports into the country. So this was really a concerted effort of exporters working together, working with the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, working with the Egyptian government. So it's a cross-government effort, really, and it involves DBT, the Department for Business and Trade, DEFRA specialists, of course, and DEFRA actually has specialist food attachés based in Africa who bring really detailed knowledge of the sector to these negotiations. And I think, Egypt's a big trading partner for us. I mean, total trade about 4.7 billion, growing population, strategically located, very good relationships. I mean, the UK has a good market share in Egypt. Our fruit and vegetable exports have been growing quite a lot there. So it's an important market for us. It's a growing market for us. It's a market where we've got deep ties, long relationships. And it's £4.7 billion worth of trade. That trade is fairly mutual. We actually run an export surplus with Egypt, which is obviously great from a UK PLC perspective. I always look at it and think, if you've got certainty, you know whether the investments you're making are going to generate a return, and you can then look at a market more expansively.
In terms of dairy, though, AHDB figures show that exports of dairy were worth nearly £1.9 billion in 2022, going off to more than 135 different countries. In the grand scheme of trade, isn't a deal worth £250 million over 5 years not really all that significant?
Do you know, the DBT publishes, we publish a trade outlook called the Global Trade Outlook, and it looks ahead over the coming decades out to 2050. And emerging markets are going to become increasingly important in terms of our total trade. Something like 25% of the world's working age population is going to be in Africa by 2050. Egypt's a country of more than 120 million people that's growing rapidly. So you're right, at some level or other, you could look at it today and say, does this really matter? But actually, strategically, these things really do matter. And for me personally, sort of one of the things about this job is actually you're doing things that can really have a benefit for a significant period of time.
John Humphrey. And that's all from us for today. I'm Kaz Graham. The producer was Rebecca Rooney. And Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.